Welcome to the Better Marketing for a Better World Pro Seminar on Innovating for Good. My name is Christine Moorman, and I'm joined by my co-host Rajesh Chandy, who will help me lead this event. As many of you know, the aim of the BMBW, or Better Marketing for a Better World initiative, is to build community and to support the development and dissemination of knowledge on how marketing can improve lives, sustain livelihoods, and strengthen society while benefiting the world at large. And today we take on a topic that is near and dear to my heart, which is the idea of innovating and innovating for good in particular. And as with all of the pro seminar series that we've run, what we aim to do with this is really to improve knowledge on how marketing can contribute in this way. And our approach is to ask a group of scholars, leading scholars who work in this area, to share their ideas from research on topics that we think can inspire, both instruct and inspire the development of new knowledge. And then we'll have a discussion of those ideas. So this is a relatively unique approach. As you'll see, many of the scholars that we've invited will not present their own work, but instead we asked them to pick papers that we thought would be really helpful to you as you think about this topic. But before we go to the presentations, we thought we'd start with a short set of polls so that we can kind of see what's going on with the group that's here with us today. So I'll turn it over to Rajesh, who will lead us on these polls. Rajesh?
Okay, so this is about stage setting, and I realize there are folks from all over the world here. So even if it's 6 o'clock in the morning, as it is for Darren Dahl and Lan Luo here, this should hopefully not be too difficult. So poll number one is about what your primary domain of research is. Yeah. Okay, so the consumer behavior group substantially. A significant majority, 2/3 of the group here considers their primary domain of research to be consumer behavior. Thank you. Which takes us to our next question. Are you, within the domain of interest, domain of innovation, what is your primary area of interest? A minority, a small 8% on innovation policy, and majority on innovation development and adoption, and about 40% on development and commercialization. Excellent. And our final question: are you currently working on research on innovating for good? Okay, 50-50 roughly. 50-50 roughly. Excellent. Chris, you want to take over?
Yes, thanks, Rajesh. So that's nice. So you can sort of see who else is in the room with you, and that might be useful when we get into the discussion groups. So the way that we'll run the pro seminars will take about an hour to have the guest scholars present. And you should know that we've restricted them to 5 minutes, so which is very difficult to present the idea of a paper. So they will be short, and then we'll ask them a follow-up question. You should save some of your questions that you might have about these papers for the breakout rooms. And there is a list of all of the papers that they're presenting from up on the BMBW site, but no need to go there now, but just so you know for the future. So we'll start approximately an hour, then we'll take a short break, probably a little after 10 o'clock Eastern time. And then we'll go into a set of breakout rooms where at least 1 or 2 of the panel members will be in the room with you. So think about some of the questions that you might have about this topic or any specific topic related to innovating for good. So I think we're ready to start. So the presentations are mostly in alphabetical order. Rajesh put himself at the end because he didn't want to go first. So we're going to start with Darren. Actually, this is the full list of panel members. So Darren and Jacob, Lan, I'll present, Martin, Alina, Olivier, and Rajesh. So again, a broad range of people from different places around the world, also working on very, very different topics, as you'll see. So I think this is going to be super interesting. Let's go ahead and get started then with Darren. Darren, do you want to take over?
Sure. So first off, big thanks to Rajesh and Chris for organizing this and for inviting us to speak. And we've been asked to just profile a paper that we thought was interesting in this space. And, in thinking about that, as you'll see from theme, there's lots of different papers that we could choose from. And I picked a paper that is actually a working paper. This is not a published paper out of some lead author out of Harvard. And it relates to this notion of how social movements impact innovation. And in centering it for today, I thought it would be useful just to use the grid that actually comes out of Rajesh's and Chris's paper in JM that talks about the notion of thinking about good for the world versus good for the firm. And so this specific paper looks in that top right quadrant of that lose-win component, where sometimes we think about what's great for society and it may not necessarily be good for the world. And so how do we actually solve that problem and move it into a win-win category? And so this research truly tries to look at that, kind of the migration of a lose-win to a win-win. I think that's kind of the statement and the overall takeaway from this specific research. But why I was interested in this work, and I'll look at it more closely, is it really came down to something that happened happened to me as I was driving to work one day. Those of you may know UBC's in Vancouver, which is a pretty active activist type city. We're actually the birthplace of Greenpeace, for those that didn't know. And we continue to have all manner of protest and activism here. And I was crossing the bridge to work one day, and Extinction Rebellion, if you know this social movement, these guys are pretty hardcore. And so they love to shut down the bridges and the airport here in Vancouver. And so it can be very frustrating if you're trying to make a 9 o'clock meeting, when all of a sudden, there's a whole camp of people that are saying, stop driving, stop everything, we're about to die. And it's fun, but probably not. And so as I'm sitting in traffic waiting for Extinction Rebellion to be removed from the bridge, I kind of said to myself, is this actually useful? Does this type of social movement, this protest, does it actually help the world, or does it just create very angry professors that are trying to get to work? And I thought, has anyone done research on this? And that's where this paper actually comes into place, is these authors looked at, this notion of social movement, and they cut it in half, really. And they said, there's social movements that are aggressive and they try to push on society. And then there's social movements that try to collaborate and do something, good in society. And so the authors, wanted to say which of these actually can produce better innovation for the world. And, kind of an interesting question. Let's cut it in half and look at those that are like Extinction Rebellion, and then perhaps those like the EDF. And if those of you that are as old as me remember, in the 1980s, the Environmental Defense Fund worked with government to help solve the problem of acid rain. And it was one of the first examples of cap and trade system. And in 1990, the US Congress, they passed this amendment, right, to the Clean Air Act, which resulted in the reduction of acid rain, a real solution to an environmental problem. But that was done very collaboratively, very different than Extinction Rebellion. So what did these authors do? Well, they looked at basically pairing 500 companies to 136 environmental organizations. And they used media, press releases, information from the public space to try to divide these environmental organizations in half, try to find out which of them was actually looking to be aggressive and cause conflict, and which was looking to collaborate and work with these 500 organizations. And they built a big model, which I won't get into, but the dependent variable they were interested in is, well, what kind of patents then came out of these big companies after this push, right, either collaboratively or aggressively from these social movements. And in one DV, they look at just green products in general. And in the second, they looked at more novel green products. And so they wanted to see, which would push these organizations forward in a positive way. And the punchline was they found that both types of social movements actually helped these companies produce novel and innovative green products. What was interesting is the contentious social movements increased patents by, they estimate, about 7%, but it was patents that were very specific to the cause as it related to the organization. So they would react to Extinction Rebellion, let's say, specifically on climate change. The collaborative type of social movements that actually worked with the organization saw an increase of 12%, so a little bit more in terms of innovation. And here they produce more novel green innovations. And so a little more breadth, a little more spread in terms of what was potentially possible. And so the question that they end with in this paper is, well, why does that happen? And so for the conflicting social movements that were aggressive and pushed hard, right, they argue that it was more of a risk reduction. Like how do we manage the threat of these angry Extinction Rebellion people? Whereas on the flip side, the collaborative side, they argue that it's actually more, because it was collaborative, it expanded the knowledge base and expanded the solution space, and they came up with more novel and interesting ideas. And so I find this inspiring because it's something that we haven't studied a lot in marketing. We don't spend a lot of time doing research in this area of social movements, but they're a huge part of what makes our society change and where our society is going to be going in the future. And so I think it's an interesting opportunity for us to think about the sociology of society and how that's going to play a big impact or have a big impact in terms of innovation moving forward. Thanks.
Thanks, Darren. It's a super interesting paper. And you talked a little bit about mechanisms. Did they get into any more details about exactly what it is that they were learning from the experience of working with these more cooperative social movements? Was there, did they document information sharing or any details about how it affected that broader search that you described?
Right. So this research is more of a macro look, and they didn't really go deeper there. So I think that's where an opportunity really lies. They admit that limitation of the work is it is dependent on the external information of press release, media reports, and annual reports from the businesses as well. And that's where they were able to create and build a model. They don't actually look inside the organizations to see how the dynamic, would actually be working in terms of these two different types of dyads, if that makes sense. So I think that's an opportunity. There's speculation. I think obviously good research leads to new opportunities for research that follows.
And do you think that there are conditions under which a more aggressive or contentious approach may be more instructive in terms of getting firms to innovate? Because here we're talking about they went back and developed a patent, but if they're, if something really alarming is happening and they need to innovate quickly, because patents, I don't know what it's like in these kinds of industries, but they can take 2 to 5 years, depending on the type of technology. Can you see situations where a more contentious political strategy or social movement might be more effective?
Right. I think a big moderator here, which is kind of answering the question, is the context in terms of where this social movement and where these innovation organizations or companies are. So the government that surrounds it, I think, is an interesting moderator. This was done in the US. And so I think it will be very different to look at this, even in Europe versus, let's say, a more developing area of the world in Africa, potentially, and see how, the government sandbox that organizations are playing in terms of how they react to social movements. It's very hypersensitive in the US right now, very different than, let's say, some other parts of the world. So I think that would be an interesting moderator to play with.
Wonderful. And actually, that's a nice way to end, because you'll see that I think some of the other papers, Alina's, for example, gets a little bit into that macro environment. So maybe we'll be able to make some connections. Thank you so much for presenting. Really appreciate it. Cool paper. So let's go ahead and move on to our next speaker. Whoops, let me back up there. And I'm going to go ahead and introduce Jacob. We're not doing, I should have said this when I introduced Darren, is that we are not doing formal introductions to save time. These are all very well-known people. And so let's turn now to Jacob to present his paper on hope and new product adoption. Jacob?
Hi, everyone, and thanks for inviting me, and thanks for putting me in this balloon. It's a great experience. When Rajesh first emailed me, I was a little reluctant to do anything about it because, yeah, of course, it's a very important topic, but why do I know about innovation for good? So let me first start with the dilemma I had about innovation and innovation for good, and then move to the paper. Chris, would you click for, we promised not to say the word click.
That's okay.
Anyway, I don't have control on the slides. I hope I have control on the content. So for me, innovate for good was equal to innovate, that innovation is good already, because just imagine our world without innovation. Innovation is about progress, about doing better, being more efficient, more effective. So innovation is good. So what does it mean, innovation for good? So it took me a while to get back to things that I was exposed a couple of years ago about impact investments, that actually the argument was that if you are doing something good, usually they focus on pro-social things, then you are doing better. So you are doing well by doing good. So my question was, can you do better by innovate for good, not just by innovate? So it means that it's not just a strategic decision, but it's something even more tactical. Can I find some sort of innovation that can improve my situation because this is for good and not just a general innovation? And what does it mean? And then I realized that there is a big debate now about impact investment, because it means impact investment that you need government support, and sometimes you don't get it. And even if people are doing something with impact investments, who are they? We didn't elect them in order to decide what is the right agenda for doing better. So my goal is very narrow, and I want to present a paper that about hope and anxiety. It is pretty narrow, but with some twist, it can fit very well what I think about innovation for good. So just imagine that there is a new product, and then there are a lot of emotions associated with the adoption of any product. Some of them can be classified to very positive, like hope. I hope that if I invest this money, then the product will improve something in my life. But there is some sort of anxiety. Now, this is not anxiety in this paper. It's not anxiety about failure of the product, that I'm going to be disappointed that it doesn't fulfill what it promised to me, but it is anxiety of something else. So their example is about new skincare that can be associated with either a hope to improve my acne, or it can irritate my skin. So I believe that it can improve my acne, but the question is whether I'll have some side effects or adverse effects based on using that. Now, this is not exactly innovation. This is a new product. This is how it was turned. But I think the twist to innovation is not very significant, because if the new skincare involved with some new treatment or some new ingredients that previously didn't exist, then it would be closer to innovation. So when we look at this dilemma between hope and anxiety, then usually we think of some sort of modeling, right? Something positive, something negative, we can model it together and then decide what will be the reaction for different consumers. We can put different weights. But what they discovered is that actually there is a very interesting interaction there. If there is a high hope, then you want to examine whether your anxiety is in place. So you increase your engagement by looking for more details. If you increase your engagement, then you have more sense of control. So the basic finding is that if there is a high hope, anxiety is actually good for you. So if the dilemma is increased, if there is high hope and high anxiety, then basically the adoption likelihood will be higher. Now their DV was intention to adopt, and it's not really adoption. It's not a field study, but I think it could be nice to see the result. Chris, would you show that? Thank you. That the adoption can be increased. Doesn't have to be linear, but it can be increased as this dilemma is increased. Putting in their words, then anxiety might actually help. How is it related to innovation for good? I thought about disabilities. Many people have disabilities. The example that I cannot share with detail in the interest of time, but maybe in the breakout rooms, could be depression. 20% of the population, this is before COVID, were or are exposed to some sort of depression episode. And sometimes innovation can help to that. There are some new apps, very interesting technology. Just imagine a psychiatrist that prescribes you an app. So there could be a lot of hope for this, but also anxiety. Can I work with apps? And this means also sharing the information with the other people. So there is a lot of anxiety, but this means that maybe people will be more keen to adopt just because there is this anxiety. But with disabilities, the hope is very high, because if we have disability and we want to function with our disabilities, then the hope is very high. Therefore, anxiety actually is a very positive aspect. Just a quick look at the investors themselves. They also have hope and anxiety. So if you can convince them that there is a high hope for success, then maybe the anxiety also will influence the way they do their due diligence, the way they examine the innovation. So maybe even it will increase their propensity to invest in such things. So this is a tactical view, how we can turn research on innovation in order to make companies do better based on innovating for good. Yeah, I'm done.
Okay, thank you, Jacob. Thank
Yeah.
you, Jacob. And I think both Rajesh and I will ask you some questions here. One of the
Sure.
questions I had was, so you focus here on the consumer, but and you mentioned at the end the investor, but what about the manager, him or herself, that thinking about the way that their expectations for these innovations? Because part of innovating for good is that, as Darren showed, that 2 by 2, you know, having that win-win. So how is it that do you have any sense, just based on your own thinking, how they, and maybe the moderators that are explored in this paper, that how they can, you know, come to understand that the opportunity and to see the hope of both of these outcomes occurring, both the financial outcome as well as the better world outcome. Any sense of that?
So to be honest, I didn't think about this. So I'm just giving you my guts feeling about it, and maybe I'll allow myself to say the opposite after the breakout rooms. But I think with managers, the problem is a little different. I think they're overly optimistic. We know all the statistics about how they overestimate performances, and that most marketing plans are failures, but not because the product is a failure, but the expectations were too high. So if they have such a high expectations, then I think that there's no anxiety there. They just believe in their, maybe they should believe because they need to believe in what they're doing, but it's just a feeling. I don't think this interaction exists in their decision-making process, but of course I may be wrong. Maybe we should ask the authors.
Well, it's an interesting question, because I think you're right, now that you've said it, about the fact that they do often have these unrealistic expectations. But then why is it that there is so little innovation? I mean, even in the kinds of innovation in the work that you've done, and in the company that you started many years ago, you know, do managers think about these better world outcomes in this way? Do they have, you know, what are their expectations in that area? Or are they more worried about, you know, getting into trouble, if, you know, meaning like that their shareholders won't like these better world innovations? What is there a process unfolding there that's different in your experience?
So maybe I'm thinking together with you, maybe it's a two-stage kind of process. In the first stage, they are in prevention mode. They don't want to fail. So they're afraid of innovation. It's overly generalized statement, of course, but they may be more afraid and therefore reluctant to accept risks. But once there is a decision for a new product, then I think they switch to promotion mode. And then, and it's like, I think it's something almost binary, like either prevention or promotion. There are no continuous spectrum in between. Just a thought. And if this is the case, then it explains why we don't see enough innovations. And when we see innovations, why they just run ahead and always late in pulling the plug, if this is the case of failure.
Thank you so much for going down that path with me, because I think we saw it a little bit in the poll when we started the session, that there's a little bit less on the development of innovations. I think Darren and Paige, on the behavioral side, most people have focused on the consumer adoption of the innovation instead of the manager's creation or development of the innovation. But as you described it, it's actually really clear that so many of the same, emotional and intellectual dynamics are occurring on the manager side as we see in the case of the consumer. So I hadn't even thought about that point of view until you started presenting. So thank you for taking off in that direction with me, and thanks for presenting.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's go on to our next presenter. And Lan Lu is here with us from USC, and I'll let her take over.
Thank you for inviting me to this panel discussion. So I have to say that first of all, as a disclaimer, when Chris and Rajesh contact me for speaking on this panel, the first paper that came to my mind is by Olivia and Odette, this paper in Marketing Science 2017. And so at that time, I had no idea Olivia will also be on the panel. So we're in a very interesting situation that both the presenter and also the author, is on the panel. So I guess, if I have questions that I couldn't handle, Olivia, the author, could also help me out. So this is kind of very interesting paper. Can we go to the next slide? There are multiple reasons that I find this paper super intuitive and also amazingly useful. So I will kind of break it down into what this paper is about and why it's about innovating for good and why do I find it, super inspirational. And so the paper essentially talk about very interesting idea of, how can we identify creative ideas? And if you think about this, this is a really, really fundamental question for both marketing academia and business practitioners, right? So we're always looking for good ideas. And it always seems to be daunting to find good ideas. And also there are so many ideas out there. And how do we know which idea, is worth pursuing? So this paper essentially, talk about very simple, but very convincing kind of idea is, if you think about ideas, essentially we can think about them, we can break down almost any idea as kind of multiple ingredients. And ideas that really are judged as more creative in general are the ones that you can find kind of, a balance between familiarity and novelty. So the idea is if you have idea that's, all the main ingredients in the idea are too similar to past ideas, people don't find it creative. However, on the opposite side, if you have an idea that's too novel, people also don't think it's creative. So finding this sweet spot between familiarity and novelty, that really is kind of the key ingredient of creativity. So I really find this basic idea super, super intuitive and also super interesting. And if you think about this, right, so creativity is really a key input into all innovations. And in our modern society, we all spend so much time and effort looking for good ideas. And just like, Jacob said in the previous presentation, there are so many failed ideas. There are also so many failed innovations. So many of us, we're also like many of us have failed papers, right? And lots of companies have failed products. And if we can figure out a way to really figure out how we can generate better, more creative ideas, and also figure out how we can screening ideas, those are the, really can help our society to be more efficient, and we can move forward with better ideas and a better society. So I really think that, although, this paper talk about like 6 different studies, different type of applications, different setup, but I think the basic idea is super, super robust and super simple, and this idea will never go out of fashion. So why do I find it inspiring? So I will kind of break it down a little bit. So like, first of all, I talk about it. I really think this idea itself is very intuitive and it makes lots of sense. And another thing I really like about this paper is this paper really talk about a way to evaluating creative ideas in a very scalable way. So we all know that we live in today's modern society. There's really not a shortage of ideas. So everybody, right? Like, social media, websites, blogs, everybody can contribute ideas. And the question from our perspective, also from firm's perspective, is also how we can really evaluate many, many ideas at scale. And in the past, we there have been like firms use professional judges, or we use like amateur consumers or consumer panels to evaluate those ideas. But this paper really talk about this using this machine learning technique to evaluate ideas at scale. So that the essential, you could have you could evaluate millions of ideas all at once. I really like this general approach. Again, make this idea screening also very scalable, efficient, and really reduce resources and make everything just more efficient. And lastly, I was very impressed with this paper, how it really talk about different studies, different setting, and at the end of the day, everything's super robust. So I really think that although this paper mostly focusing on creating ideas, and also this paper focused on using text mining to evaluate ideas, like evaluate whether or not this idea is creative. But I really think this general idea can be expanded to many other future domains. For example, some of the ideas I thought about is this general idea could be also be expanded to scientific research. So when we teach our PhD students, when we think about what type of ideas are worth pursuing, I really think there's some really inspiring thoughts in this paper. And another area I can think about is radical innovations. Again, radical innovations, another area that a lot of companies are super interested in, with also extremely high failure rates. So I really believe that this fundamental idea could be very helpful in terms of when we think about how we should create or evaluate radical innovations. So perhaps the most successful radical innovations are not the ones that are super novel. They should be really kind of try to be at this sweet spot of familiarity and novelty. And lastly, there are so many creative products out there, like songs, music. You can think about movies, books. And I really, again, there's not a shortage of creative products out there, but the question is really how we find the right product for the right individual or for the right company. So I really believe that, the basic idea here could also be used for recommendations of creative products, which can also make everything super interesting.
Thank you, Lan. That was wonderfully described. I had just a clarification. Actually, one of the cool things about the paper, since Olivier is far away, you can't see him blush. So one of the cool things about the paper also is just, as you said, how practical it is and how it could be implemented across domains. Can you help us, those of us who haven't read the paper yet, can you help us sort of think through? So if I'm a manager, say, and I want to do good, for example, I want to use smartphones to help users become healthier. That's one of the examples in the paper.
Yes.
What would I need to do in order to implement the idea?
So again, I think what this paper basically is saying is, in this case, there are many different ways that you could collect ideas, right? You could just simply do Google. You could also, use consumer panel. You could also use the internal company in-house experts. And the question here is really, once you collect collective set of ideas, and how you identify kind of the golden idea that can really be beneficial for the company and also for consumers. And I think that's really kind of the key idea in this paper. I really find it very inspiring and intuitive. We need to find the golden idea, and it's so hard to find the golden idea, and the paper kind of provides a pointer to that direction.
And there's also some cool work on text mining that I know Olivier and colleagues have worked on, but perhaps we could bring that up in the overall discussion as well. Thank you very much. Over to a familiar face, Chris Moorman.
Thanks, Rajesh. So I'm going to present a paper that I actually just accepted at the Journal of Marketing by Pierre-Jan, Zeynep, and Aya. And this paper looks at the coffee industry to try to make a bigger point about innovation within industries. So let me just kind of set up the talk the way that they set up their paper, which is they refer back to the 1970s when annual coffee consumption was experiencing a steady decline, and years of consolidation within the industry, not a lot of diversity of firms, et cetera. Mostly people consume drip and instant coffee. Some of you, none of you lived through this, or maybe some of you did, whose faces I can't see. But this period lasted until the early 90s, and it was, they call it the first wave. I guess that's what it's called in the industry, the first wave. And but by the early 90s, that's when Starbucks came in, and they basically, you know, introduced a whole new experience, much better coffee, and really drove the market through the 90s. And that period is often referred to as the second wave. And of course, all of you teach the example of their growth, which went from 84 coffee shops in 1991 to 8,836 by 2006. But what's interesting is that by the mid 2000s, sales had started to decline, and the share price of the company dropped by more than 50%. And Starbucks' market driving role was really stalling. So what should have happened next is really not clear. But what did happen was that through 2010s and 20s, the market really continued to expand. And this evolutionary period is often called the third wave. And so that's what they tried to explain. Why is it that we ended up with this kind of, you know, further expansion of an industry where you might not have expected that to happen, based on everything that we know about product life cycles, et cetera, et cetera. And what they do in this paper is that they make the argument and provide some evidence for the fact that industries can in fact remain vital and attractive to consumers when firms innovate by expanding the practices that they engage in. Now, practices are broadly viewed as kind of the competencies and meanings that, and there's one other, the actual materials, like the objects that are used within the production and consumption process, when those go through some kind of transformation and translation. And so what they argue is that firms fit into one of these two broad classifications that you can see of craft and commercial, that they operate under two different kinds of logics. And those logics are essentially either craft on the side of focusing on the aesthetic experience, or commercial, where you're focused more on the profitability and scale of the enterprise. And so with this 2x2, what they try to capture is that there were these practices that were essentially being shared by different parts of this industry, whether you were craft or commercial, or whether you were very specialized, which many companies are, or you were more of a generalist. And they document in the paper various kinds of strategies that occurred. Just as a few examples, this idea of commercializing transformation, that the commercial generalist firm, think of somebody like Horton's, for example, they took these kind of handcrafted coffee drinks that were coming out of the craft coffee companies, and developed very good technologies for capturing that flavor and experience using a machine, which allowed them, again, to bring it to scale. On the other hand, you take something like a craft transformation, which involved the craft companies, the craft specialists in this case, taking this highly popular Starbucks pumpkin spice latte and making it an even more pleasing aesthetic experience. They made, for example, their own spices, which made it very special, and they were able to make the claims that it was, again, a much more craft experience. And they go through all of these within the paper. And so through these kinds of learning activities, I'll characterize them that way, these learning activities, the industry actually continued to revitalize itself over time instead of experiencing that decline. So how is this about innovating for good? Well, if you think about it, if industries can renew in this way, a lot of these small firms entered, which was really a neat thing to see. Large firms like Starbucks can survive. And as a result, you have job creation, you have job retention. And then also for me personally, I'll just say that I think it's really important that we bring a sort of a creative expression or aesthetic into the commercial world. I think it makes life so much more interesting and pleasing. And I think it's important to be able to point to that and herald it and see how it was rewarded. I think that's really good for society. I think it's inspiring, and the reason I just love this paper, really from the beginning of the review process, I just love the idea that they took things up to the industry level, which is a pretty uncommon place to operate. And we can see with this paper how it can help make the world a better place. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you. I can see not just the usual reasons why it relates to the topic of innovating for good, jobs, renovation and rejuvenation, but also beauty, as a good, aesthetic value as a good. Thank you. And especially in the context of too often, when people talk about the coffee industry, very often it is in the context of, for the price of a latte, you could feed a child in somewhere. My dad used to be a coffee farmer, and the coffee farmer never got any of the returns to the price of the latte. And so my question to you was, so looking forward, you described beautifully the process that happened from the 70s and then 90s and beyond. Looking forward, to the extent that someone wants to help coffee farmers in Ethiopia, which is after all the origin location. You point out how you have these inter-organizational, learning networks. What would you say to those based on the results of the paper? How would you apply these ideas to the renovation of this very industry, for good, far away? What lessons would you take away to facilitate this kind of learning?
Well, that's a great question, and I should make clear, and they focus on coffee, but then in the back end of the paper, in a set of web appendices, they go through industry after industry and point to this kind of revitalization, whether it's autos or soap or whatever it happens to be. So I would say, one of the things that we know about managers is that they suffer from what, I forget the second author, but Ed Zajac in one of his papers, he calls these things competitive blind spots, about where they should be looking for competitors. But you could make the same argument as to where they should be thinking about opportunities for growth and for good. And so managers tend to, for example, look within their industry. They tend to look at the large companies. They tend to look within their own geographical boundaries, when in fact, competitors and innovation often come from outside the industry. They come from outside the country. And so I think the idea of encouraging learning from competitors in a way where you can facilitate this kind of knowledge transfer that really can help improve. Because if we're able to create this kind of revitalization, then we can create, I think, much better, again, jobs, or use these products and services coming from the small coffee farmer in Ethiopia. In fact, they talk a lot about those kinds of things. People all over the world doing these super innovative things that then, Hortons or Starbucks or whomever was able to pick up on those and turn them into something much bigger. So it turns out to be a real win-win, to go back to what Darren mentioned earlier.
Thank you, Chris. Martin.
Yes, hi everyone. When I got the invitation to think about some stimulating research for innovating for good, I thought I'd first get a feeling of what the business world is doing, and let's say beyond marketing, what management scholars are thinking at this point in time. And so the first interesting book I identified is called Better Business by Christopher Marquise is a management researcher. And the subtitle is How the B Corp Movement is Remaking Capitalism. And so if you're not familiar with the B Corp label, so B Corp is a label you get if you are a certified benefit corporation, which the benefit corporation basically says you have a triple bottom line that is not looking only at profits, but also at people and planet. And when you get that label, you basically are being reassessed on this benefit impact assessment. I think every 2 years or something like that. So that I found that trend pretty interesting, and it's not only niche companies that are aiming at that certificate, but also big companies like Danone is about to get that. Of course, Patagonia is a classical company that got that certification. And across the board, going even to French windmills that also are interested in getting this label. So, but when it really comes to innovation, this book, and I think also big parts of the current debate, was pretty silent on how innovation should be potentially executed, maybe in a different way, because the what is pretty clear. And I found that almost obvious that today we see when we discuss topics with students in class, and when you observe what managers care, of course, to a certain extent, it's always that the consumer is forcing companies to become good in a way. If you think as an example for in Europe, if you look at any retailer, they have a huge assortment of organic food and everything like that. And people start to care about the animals, about the planet, and so on. So of course, as a response to that, firms need to innovate and need to think about growing artificial meat and things like that. So there's a lot of push, so to say, from the consumer in terms of the what, but it was not clear to me how this trend of a better world changes the way we go about innovation more fundamentally. And I think this is a fascinating question for me, and that brought me to the paper that eventually I decided to share with you, which is a pretty uncommon paper compared to maybe the papers that the others were presenting, because it's not really an empirical research as we are used to. It's actually from a material scientist, a comment in the journal Science that talks about an interesting aspect that I think is a different way to think about the how in the innovation equation. And so one of the cool things in this essay I learned is that there is a machine that is called the REP. It's a machine that costs less than 1,000 euros, and it is a partially self-replicating rapid prototyping machine. So if you have that machine, you can reproduce 50% of its own parts. And you can think of it as a 3D printer. Of course, you can also print all kinds of other designs. This researcher, Josh Pierce, discusses this concept in the context of research, where we talk about research instruments, research equipment, scientific instruments. So we as users, so to say, so how do we get the equipment we need to have in order to do good research? Of course, as social scientists, we are not really the users of this type, but if we go into details, it's great. So this researcher says basically that with the idea of open source hardware, all of a sudden you can do good, so to say, for researchers, because these equipments become affordable, basically also to parts in the world and to universities and research institutions that do not have the money that the richer institutions have. And the key term in this paper that I found very stimulating is open source hardware. You might be familiar with open source software, and some years ago there have also been some influential innovation papers in the management field on this fascinating concept in the software domain. But the new thing here is that it's not about software, but actually hardware. And the definition of this term is that it refers to hardware whose design is made publicly available so that anyone can study, modify, distribute, make, and sell the design or hardware based on that design. So I found that very cool, and the examples that are described in this paper make the point very clear that this can potentially be about innovating for good, because in this context that they studied, they show that the research equipment becomes affordable to a much broader audience. And they also have some examples where if you would buy a commercially available solution for these researchers, it could be that you pay $2,500 for a certain piece. But if you go for this alternative, going through the open source hardware system, it all of a sudden only costs $50, and you basically get the same problem solution. So you see the magnitude of the potential effect. And so it's a different way to think about innovation. And what I find very inspiring about that is that we can talk a lot about doing good for the world, but when you think about how to go about innovation, we have been teaching the students that we have to protect the rent of innovation for the firm, because that's the whole point of business, that we want to maximize the return on investment of our innovation activities. And you will certainly know very well that many innovation scholars very often study the innovation performance of firms using the number of patents firms are making and the citations you get to these patents. But the patent basically means I'm going to protect the invention and the discovery for the usage of the firm. And this open source hardware philosophy now radically departs from that idea, because you say, I put it out there to the market, it's for free. So I find that fascinating, because if you think of this 2x2 design that Chris and the others in the Better World paradigm were propagating, it seems intuitive that this open source hardware and the case that the science paper talks about really goes into the good for the world dimension. But intuitively, we would probably also say it's not so good for the firm, right? Because if you put everything out there, then you do not get a repeated return, and you definitely do not maximize the return. But it's good for the world potentially, because then all of a sudden other companies, other users can benefit, build on it, and reach our global goals faster, for example, to make the world greener, so to say. So I think for us researchers, the interesting opportunity lies in the idea to move this lose-win cell, so to say, into a win-win zone. And I have no answer to that, but I find it very interesting to think about that if you do this innovation paradigm differently, can you still get the most important P for companies in the B corporation sense, that you also push profits in a long-term perspective. And so I try to look and identify some companies also that are following this in a more classic profit context. I also found like there's actually an association of open science hardware, so to say, where you also get a certificate for that. And one company that is using that is called Allbirds. It's a fashion or a sneakers company. It was founded in 2015, I think. And 6 years later, they went public and have now a market capitalization of 4 or 5 billion. So it has grown to a sizable company. And what one of their, so they innovate a lot for a greater good, so particularly for sustainability goals. And one of the nice inventions that they made is that they have developed something that's called the sugarcane-based material, the sweet foam technology, that is kind of cool, because traditionally, if you produce the sole of a shoe, that's not very good for the environment. And they have come up with a technology that is not only carbon neutral, but actually carbon negative. And instead of protecting this technology, they decided to launch this as an open source hardware. So the whole industry can benefit, the whole industry can adopt. And of course, you can imagine that then potentially the effect on a good environment will be faster and stronger that way. But at the same time, it's an open question of why the company would survive in the next couple of years if they do not protect their invention. So I think here is a very interesting tension for researchers, I think in all camps, analytical modelers, empirical researchers, consumer behavior researchers, and so on, to study actually whether a different way, a fundamentally different way about how to go about innovation can eventually help us to make the world better on the one hand, but also on the other hand to guarantee some profits for firms.
Thank you, Martin. I'm sensitive to the fact that we have 3 more presentations coming up, and a terrific presentation. Thank you. But so I'm going to keep my question very short. And but let me first say thank you for presenting not just the one paper, but a whole research agenda around it. In fact, our next speaker, Alina, does a lot of work on business model innovation, and I keep thinking of the possibilities there. A quick question for you. So here's a paper in Science by a material scientist. How did you go? How did you find this? I'm curious about the process of knowledge generation in your case, given all the work you've done.
That's a great question. So I see Lukas Meyer was in the audience. He's a PhD, now postdoc student from Germany. We're working on a couple of projects together, and one of the things is tied to open source hardware. And he gave me a pointer to some of these, and that's where this all comes together.
So the lesson, moral of the story is hang around with good PhD students and postdocs. Thank you. Alina, over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Chris and Rajesh, and thank you to all that are joining us this morning. So I have to say, kind of like Jacob, when Chris and Rajesh reached out to me, my very first reaction was innovation for good. All innovation is for good, because a product who does not increase somebody's utility is not viable, would not last long in the market. And then if it increases somebody's utility, if you accept that general welfare is the sum of everybody's utilities, then it should be innovation for good. And I think that what Rajesh and Chris and where we're trying to go with this is what we're trying to say here is that it's innovation that increases somebody's utility but does not have negative externalities, or maybe has positive externalities, that you're not harming others by using this product. And so with that in mind, I thought of looking in the realm of creating economically and ecologically sustainable products and services. And I chose a paper that discusses the factors that can encourage firms to adopt a process innovation that promotes, in this particular case, green building standards. So I chose a paper from the Academy of Management Journal for 2 reasons. First of all, because I am particularly very interested in the drivers of green consumption. But second, I feel that we as marketers can pick up from where they left and really build on their findings and provide insight on the mechanism and provide more actionable solution to the problem that they've identified. So the adoption of LEED green building standards, LEED stands for Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design. In a nutshell, this paper is about 2 drivers. One are the conditions of the market in which these firms who are considering adopting these voluntary standards operate. And there are 2 kinds of markets. There are markets that have what the authors call a stronger market logic, meaning that they're focused on economic prosperity, wealth creation, individualism, meaning that the way they measure this is typically more conservative places, kind of like Texas. Texas has a lot of good incentives for business. lower taxes, but at the same time, a more conservative environment that is supposedly focused more on market incentives and less on the collective good. And at the opposite end of the spectrum, other markets have a stronger community logic that is focused on the commitment to the community, reciprocity, and collective benefit. It turns out that whether firms operate in one of those two types of markets has very strong implication as to whether they would adopt this kind of green building standards or not. And so this is one factor that contributes. And the other is what actors, whether it's the government or private actors in that market, encourage firms to adopt these standards. And so this paper looks at the interface of this set of market conditions and the actors that encourage the adoptions of these standards, and explores how that happens. And so here's in a nutshell what they find, which is actually was quite surprising to me. In markets with strong market logic, again, think of states like Texas, strong incentives for business, but maybe not so much emphasis on the common good. Government incentives work better, things like both policy and financial incentives. Support of market intermediaries. So for green building, think of market intermediaries like professionals that obtain an LEED certification and can help with consultancy, can give some validity to this movement. So essentially support from professionals who are knowledgeable in this realm and can help firms implement those standards. And also advocacy groups promoting the technology. These are non-profits organizations like the US Green Building Council who operate in those areas. They are also more effective at convincing firms to adopt these voluntary standards in regions with a strong market logic. None of these have any effect in regions with strong community logic. So let me stop for a second, because when I read this, I thought, okay, communities with strong community logic already have adopted green standards more so than regions with strong market logic. And that's not the case. That's not what they found. So if you take all these actors out, it turns out that regions with stronger community logics have not adopted green standards more than regions with strong market logic. So the level field is pretty equal there. In these regions that are focused more on communities and on the collective benefit, the only private actors that seem to have an influence on firms are these so-called enviro entrepreneurs, which are suppliers and partners that make it possible for firms to implement these standards. So if I'm a custom home builder in Texas, and I'm trying to build homes that are LEED certified, I'm going to need suppliers who sell the right type of insulation, the right type of windows, the right type of paint, and what have you. Only to the extent to which these are present in that region. In regions with strong community logic, firms are more likely to adopt the LEED standards. And by the way, the dependent variable is very straightforward. How many buildings certified with this standard are in each metropolitan statistical area? So that's their unit of analysis. So it's a very straightforward dependent variable that I feel captures well the extent to which these firms adopt the standards. And so you take a look at this and you say, whoa, how can this be possible? Moreover, they also find that when private actors come into a market with strong market logic, the government incentives make no difference whatsoever. It appears that firms pay more attention to these private actors and to their to any type of pressure or encouragement from these private actors, then they pay attention to government incentives. So I looked at the results and I thought, wow, so much wasted effort and so much opportunity in these areas in which it appears that green building standards are not being adopted, my first question when I looked at the results is how can one change that? What can we do, particularly in regions with strong community logic, to increase the adoption of green standards? My first thought was, there's got to be some failure of framing the message. I mean, somebody is not communicating well in these regions. And so with so many behavioral colleagues in the audience, I feel that there's obviously a lot of research in framing, but I'm not sure whether it is from these higher level organizations and not firms on how they should communicate to firms to encourage firms to adopt these technologies that would lead to products that are better for everyone. So this is one area where I feel there's quite a bit of potential. Second, I think more research is needed to see how is it possible that nonprofit organizations who are in a way maybe intended to help along the adoption, and maybe in their mind they think that they're reinforcing any government efforts in the same direction, to actually drown out and make the government efforts ineffective. So a little bit more research there on how these private actors that have a common goal can collaborate to lead to the adoption of this technology, I think is also needed. In a lot of quite surprising results in there. And finally, I feel part of the reason I chose this paper is that I am personally quite passionate about process and business model innovation, as Rajesh has mentioned. I feel we focus so much on products, but a lot of innovation for good does happen at the process level and at the business model innovation level. And we take the easy way out by looking at products because they're easy to count, it's easy to find data. And I think we should take a closer look at the macro environment and at technology adoption at a macro environment, and at changes in business model innovations that can foster innovation for good. And we still have quite a lot to uncover there. So I'm going to stop because I know we're out of time, but I'm super happy to talk about this in the breakout session.
Yeah, thank you, Alina. And thank you for pointing us back to process innovation, which I think does go under the radar. Just one quick question, which is, where do these enviro entrepreneurs come from? I wondered about whether they were actually arising from what you see in the column, the incentives, the market intermediaries, the advocacy groups, whether they were emerging from that context. Is that possible, or are they able to really separate those in the paper?
So again, that they are, the way they're measuring it is that they're looking at suppliers who are pushing the kind of products that are certified, that fall within the realm of the standards. And to me, this is 100% an entrepreneurship story. You look at what's available in an area, you see the possibility. I mean, the LED standards are voluntary today, but as it was the case in the auto industry and others, they might be mandated to some extent in the future. And so they feel that maybe this is a market that is going to grow. And so they start positioning themselves in that market to be ready in case the market grows or that some of these standards become mandated. And so I think it's just purely entrepreneurship. Let's start building up in that space, because tomorrow all the firms might need to buy these materials. And maybe it is a market-driven mechanism, and maybe that's why they seem to be such a strong driver across both communities with strong market logic and community logic.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
So we'll turn now to Olivier, who will present work on the moral machine. Welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Chris and Rajesh, for organizing this session. So the paper that I chose is from Nature. This is a paper that basically used a conjoint analysis style study with millions of people all over the world to measure people's moral values and moral preferences. So they used the version of the trolley problem, which everyone, oh, you can go back, Chris, sorry. Everyone is familiar with. You have, in the context of autonomous cars, self-driving cars. So you have a self-driving car driving with 3 passengers, and there's 3 people crossing the road. So the self-driving car has some built-in algorithms that could actually decide to, so the car can only save these people crossing the street if the car actually deviates and hits a block, which will actually kill people in the car. So it's a very morbid scenario, sorry. And so the car has to make a trade-off. Do I save the people crossing the street, or do I save the passengers in the car? And so the authors give different scenarios. What if the passengers are old? What if there are children? What if the people crossing are disabled, young, person with a stroller? What if a cat, a dog, to try to measure preferences for basically more values and who deserves to be saved first. So now we can move on, Chris. Thank you. So that's basically the idea. And so we can use these tools that have been used in marketing, like content analysis, to quantify consumers' moral preferences and moral trade-offs, which can then help us develop new products that are going to be consistent with these values. And so that's definitely, of course, relevant for innovations for a better world, because this allows us to capture and quantify what is the better world in the first place. And so if we want to make sure that the new products to develop have more values that are consistent with the public, then we need to measure these values. But I think this is in particular inspiring because this 2x2 good for the world, good for the firm has come up multiple times today. This is coming from the editorial of Rajesh, Gita, Chris, and John. And so, of course, we always want to be in the win-win situation. We want innovation that is going to be good for the firm and good for the world. And it's usually, I think, reasonably clear what is good for the firm. I mean, there may be a short-term versus long-term trade-off, but usually, there's not too much ambiguity. But the good for the world, actually, if you think about this, is very ambiguous. It's subjective. And so this paper illustrates that different people have different beliefs on what is good for the world, what is moral, who should be saved when we develop new self-driving cars, what value should we give to the car when it's going to actually sometimes make some very hard decisions. And so this really challenges the question that there's a universal good and bad. Maybe actually it's not universal. Different people have different values. Maybe it's multidimensional. So actually, we haven't talked about the war in Ukraine today, which I think actually, if you think of a better world, I think it's hard to not talk about this. And there's a paper that I saw last week, actually, as a little tangent, that actually suggests that firms that cut ties with Russia actually were actually punished by the stock market. So their market cap actually went down after they cut ties from Russia. And so that's a case in which you have a firm, a manager deciding to cut ties with Russia. And so maybe it's helping the world by maybe hurting the Russian war efforts, but maybe it's also decreasing shareholder value, which might actually, is good for the world. And of course, with getting political, also the question, are we hurting the Russian people in the process? Is that good for the world as well? So we can see it becomes very quickly very multidimensional. There's different stakeholders, different values. And the win-win is the holy grail, but unfortunately, oftentimes, it's not universal that something is going to be better for the world. And so then the question becomes, who gets to decide? I mean, do we as academics get to decide what is good for the world? Policymakers, who gets to decide this? And actually, as a last thought also, what they found in this paper is that, for example, people felt that the life of an old person or homeless person was less worthy of being saved than the life of a child. So does it mean that if we want to be good for the world, we have to discriminate in some way, because we're going to have to maybe sacrifice an old person for a younger person? So can good also be discriminatory? I think that's an interesting question. So I know it's a bit philosophical, but I think it's kind of looking at the bigger picture of what is actually good for the world in the first place. So I think I'm going to stop here because we don't have too much time. So.
Thank you, Olivier. Yes, we're out of time, but this is a super interesting paper. Thank you for bringing this to our attention. So what does this imply from, as with many I mean, impressive papers. It leaves more questions than answers. Not to mention the incredible effort that went into running this study, which was inspiring in itself. What does this imply, especially given what Alina was saying earlier about market-based logics? The market would say, yeah, homeless person, maybe not, or old person, and so on. Where do you think the scholarly community, or indeed the practitioner community, could take this forward?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think we need to decide, there's the humanities and there's the social science and the business. I think there's different hats we could wear as a marketing scientist. And we have to decide a little bit, do we want to get into, moral values and judgments, or do we just want to maybe provide the tools for managers and equip them to make these decisions without necessarily telling them what is good for the world and what is good for the firm? That's, I agree. This is raising more questions than it's giving answers. But it just suggests that the topic is very complicated, and I think that which makes it more interesting, of course. But I think I think when we say better for the world, I think we're implying that there's a good and a bad, and that there's better and worse. And I think this is an assumption that we have to be, I think, aware of when we talk about this topic. I think that's my point. Actually, if anything, is just us being aware that this is maybe subjective.
So very true. Thank you.
Thank you.
Chris, we decided while all this was happening that we will skip my talk. So we'll go straight to break.
Sorry.
No, that's okay.
Let me just first thank all of the speakers for sharing their ideas. And I know it's early in the morning and it takes some effort, so we really appreciate you participating. It is for a better world, and so we appreciate your participation. What we want to do is we're going to go into breakouts, but before we do that, because we won't come back into this room, we just want to promote our next webinar, a BMBW Pro seminar rather, on digital marketing for a better world. We don't have our speakers lined up yet. We will soon. But if you want to snap this QR code, and you can go ahead and register now, or just put it in your planner to go back and check later. But we wanted to let you know about that. It'll be a really nice lineup of people across the spectrum as we've had today.